This month, the biggest television event of the summer will hit the airwaves. No, not the Game of Thrones finale that was last month and bad. Not the season premiere of The Handmaid's Tale that was weeks ago. It's the stuffed to bursting two-night Democratic debates in which two blocks of 10 candidates, 20 total, will face off. It's like the G1 climax of mostly old, mostly white guys. Over the last year or so, Democratic candidates have sprung out of nowhere to introduce themselves to American voters and grab attention for at least a news cycle before another one does the exact same thing. At the time of this writing, former Vice President Joe Robinette Biden is leading the polls among the overcrowded Democratic candidates for president. When asked about why potential voters side with Biden, reactions often come in the form of nostalgia for the previous administration. Biden hitched his wagon to the popular president, and though the vice president does not dictate policy or do much of anything, the goodwill of Barack Obama seems forever tethered to Joe Biden among garden-variety Democrats. If you ask these Democrats about Biden's specific policies, they may have a difficult time coming up with an answer because Biden is bereft of ideas. The Washington Post recently sent a questionnaire to the veritable ocean of candidates and came back with lots of answers from everyone except Biden. On many issues such as changes to the Electoral College, healthcare, and immigration, Biden was the cheese who stood alone as the single Democrat who had no answer or an unclear answer. In one case, he was among a select few, but he still chickened out of giving a response. Biden's main advantage is name recognition. He's running on nothing. He's hoping you vote for him in the primaries the way Disney hoped you would show up to the new Aladdin movie, because you recognize the brand name, not because you think it'll be any good. It wasn't. Biden does not generate excitement. He generates recognition. Some Biden supporters are in his camp simply because of this false sense of electability. They believe that Biden is the best chance to unseat Donald Trump in 2020. However, history has shown that candidates that don't motivate people to vote because people are unclear about where these candidates stand tend to lose, whereas candidates that have a kind of buzz about them among their base tend to win. Even people who answered Joe Biden in these polls aren't enthusiastic about Joe Biden. They're just enthusiastic about not Trump. Most Americans do not vote, and it takes a lot to motivate people to go to the polls. Biden does not appear to be that man. Furthermore, early polling rarely tells us how the primaries will shake out. The similarly crowded Republican field last go-around showed Trump at 1% with Jeb Bush and his sad face as the frontrunners. Jeb, too, was polling high due to name recognition, in this case, only last name recognition. Republicans outside of Florida were not overly familiar with his policies, only his lineage. So, one of two things will happen. Either Biden will flame out like Jeb Bush at the hands of a more magnetic candidate, or the even more crowded Democratic field will eat itself and Biden's mainstream name recognition and establishment connections will prevail. It's too early to tell. It's also worth noting that Biden being the only way to beat Trump is demonstrably false. If these same people are so trusting of early polling, they may want to look at this other bit of early polling that shows all the major Democratic candidates polling higher than Trump. Biden has a microscopic edge here, but again, that's name recognition, and this feature will fade as other candidates become known. The debates should fix that, and give American voters a better idea about these candidates. His lead against other Democrats is already slipping. Joe Biden would obviously make a better president than Donald Trump, but considering how well the other Democrats are also faring against Trump in the polls, we don't have to settle for Biden. We don't have to imagine some white dad in a Midwest pancake house and how he might vote. No offense to the Midwest or pancakes. We can do better. We can choose someone to face the Republican president who is not simply a diet Republican, a Republican light. The former vice president has an absolutely terrible past and an equally terrible present, both of which suggest that either his campaign will be extremely polarizing and easy to defeat, or that an unlikely Biden presidency would maintain a lot of neoliberal, centrist, status quo policies that have ravaged the United States of America for a long time and have impeded progress more than helped it along. Like what, you ask? Well, Back in 1975, Biden told the Washington Post, "I still walk down the street in the black side of town. Mousy and Chops and all the boys at 13th, and I can walk in those pool halls and frankly don't know another white man involved in Delaware politics who can do that kind of thing." Wow. Okay, so in addition to the inherent cringe factor in trying to earn street cred by referring to men who probably don't exist by outlandish, racially coded nicknames, there is another problem. This quote was a reaction to accusations of racism. In the same year, Biden became one of the loudest and most bombastic opponents of a desegregation measure, commonly called busing. It simply meant that some black students would now go to schools that were previously segregated as whites only, and some white students would now go to schools that were previously segregated as blacks only. Prior to this policy, even after the official end of segregation, schools were still de facto segregated, if not de jure. Before regaling reporters with tales of Mousy and Chops, Biden told the press that this desegregation policy was the single most devastating issue that could occur to Delaware. Infamous racist cartoon character Senator Jesse Helms drafted the opposition. On September 17, 1975, when a larger education bill came up for debate, Helms offered an anti-integration, pro-segregation amendment. It would prevent the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare from withholding funding from school districts that refused to integrate. Between lynching fantasies, Helms remarked, "This is an amendment to stop the current regiments of faceless federal bureaucrats from destroying our schools." He meant white schools. That's it. Biden strongly supported Helms, saying, "I am sure it comes as a surprise to some of my colleagues that a senator with a voting record such as mine stands up and supports the Helms Amendment," and then called integration measures a bankrupt concept. Others sided against the team of Helms and Biden because the Helms Amendment would effectively destroy any progress made by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the thing that every civil rights hero of the time was striving for. The Helms Amendment did not pass, losing 48 to 43. Biden voted for the amendment. He voted for a policy that would clip the wings of the Civil Rights Act and roll back progress made by the civil rights movement. Biden lost, but he wasn't done. Not old Robinette. Biden introduced a similar bill that would still damage the Civil Rights Act, but not as much as Helms. This compromise pleased liberal senators that had previously opposed the Helms Amendment. It still gutted parts of the Civil Rights Act, particularly Title VI, but it managed to pass 50 to 43. Biden never had a change of heart about this, defending his actions as recently as 2007. One can't claim to know what is in Biden's heart, but we can see the effects his actions have had up till today, and not just how his actions affected the nation in the 70s. According to a report by the National Center for Education Statistics, much higher percentages of students of color are made to attend high-poverty schools compared to white students. Experts agree that instead of getting better over time, it's actually getting worse. The Supreme Court case of Milliken v. Bradley stated that school districts could legally be segregated as long as it was not intentional. Okay. However, this language allows districts a lot of leeway to do this through trickery and loopholes rather than simply advocating for policies that more explicitly state their purpose. This so-called colorblind segregation comes from zoning ordinances, homeowners associations, and predatory lending. Because of racialized poverty, these tactics predominantly affect black students, Hispanic students. Basically, students are segregated on an economic basis. 45% of black and Hispanic students are made to attend high-poverty schools, whereas only 8% of white students attend such schools. This is done legally because housing developments can be built that have no specific racial requirements, but do require 2-acre lots or homes that must be at least 5,000 square feet. This purposefully excludes the vast majority of people in the country from purchasing such a home, which perpetuates privileges and exclusions in favor of affluent white families, like these people in some stock footage that I find both hilarious and haunting. This puts black families in different school districts and in schools that the government barely funds for reasons. What Biden did was further advantage white families in the US and further disadvantage black families. White parents are able to choose neighborhoods with highly funded public schools or private schools, whereas black parents usually can't. Biden's law effectively gave white families a choice and took away that choice from black families. Biden once said, and this is true, that your black curly-haired son doesn't need to be in a class with my white straight-haired one to get an education. Biden repeatedly invoked Delaware's history as a slave state to appeal to Southern conservatives, once telling a Republican Rotary Club that Delaware only fought with the Union because we couldn't figure out how to get to the South. Biden has, in the past, defended his pro-segregation attitudes by exaggerating his civil rights bona fides. Another way to put that is that he lied. Biden loved to tell the public that he participated in sit-ins at restaurants, except that he later admitted that this was not true, that he absolutely was not an activist, and that the full extent of his participation in the civil rights movement was that he worked at a predominantly black swimming pool. Let's be clear here. No amount of declarations that Biden was friends with Barack Obama can remove these particular stains from the former vice president's record. Some of this may have happened in the 70s, but its effects are still being felt today. What's worse, he has never corrected this and has rarely backed down from it. He remained in the Senate for over 30 years after the law passed, and he chose to leave it on the books. Any argument that this was a long time ago is irrelevant because he had over 30 years to change his mind, and he still has not. There has been a rise in racial tension and hate crimes under the Trump administration, and a Biden presidency would do little to cure this because history has shown that he has no such ability or inclination to do so. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush delivered a speech that escalated the disastrous war on drugs. Bush presented his national drug control strategy, calling for harsher punishments, and allocated nearly $1.5 billion toward drug-related law enforcement. Bush wanted more prisons, more jails, all over the country. Biden, still technically a Democrat, believed that a Republican president's war on drugs was still not conservative enough. Biden said, "Quite frankly, the president's plan is not tough enough. The president's plan does not include enough police officers to catch the violent thugs or enough prison cells to put them away for a long time." Biden helped create the cabinet-level drug czar position. Biden also helped move legislation that anyone caught with an amount of cocaine larger than a quarter was imprisoned for a minimum of 5 years, but potentially more. Biden pushed civil asset forfeiture, which allowed the government to rob anyone that they claimed was dealing drugs. Was it abused? Of course, it always is. He pushed for the Bush administration to sentence more drug dealers to death. Former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan once said, "Drugs have destroyed many people, but bad governmental policies have destroyed more." The criminalization of drugs fuels a violent international narcotics trade. The U.S. has spent over $1 trillion trying to combat the problem with policing for about 40 years. It drains the government of funds when we could be using that money on healthcare. Zero-tolerance policies help prosecute Americans for even microscopic amounts of drugs. A report from the ACLU shows that one man, for example, was prosecuted for an amount of drugs so small that a laboratory couldn't even weigh it. He was sentenced to 15 years. If these arguments don't tug at your heartstrings, perhaps the pragmatic argument will be more helpful. The war on drugs has not worked. Nearly every study into the matter has shown that the extremely costly war on drugs has been almost completely ineffective. In fact, the war on drugs could even be worsening the problem, deterring users from seeking help when they need it. That seems to be the case in the U.S., where a record number of people died from drug overdoses a few years ago. Drug law reform and focus on treatment has never been on Biden's agenda. He voted for drug laws in 1986 and 1988, which created harsh mandatory minimums for drug possession. Biden not only mimicked conservative Republicans' ideas about the war on drugs, he went even further, hoping to brand himself as a Democrat who even Republicans would vote for. He does that a lot. Related to the war on drugs, Biden has been one of the loudest proponents of the mass incarceration movement among his own party. Biden co-authored the 1994 crime bill called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This 1994 law imposed tougher sentences and increased funding for prisons, largely contributing to the growth of the U.S. prison population from the 1990s through the 2000s. Journalist Radley Balko of the Washington Post once said of this, "The martial and carceral state has no greater friend in Washington over the last 35 years than Joe Biden." The American criminal justice system is highly racialized, and the Biden crime law made things worse. Mass incarceration is predominantly black incarceration. Black Americans are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white people, and nearly 3 times as likely as Hispanics. Conservatives and straight-up racists try to use these haunting statistics against black communities as evidence that black people are criminals. But the Sentencing Project actually concluded that racial bias and other racist factors were behind as much as 39% of the disparate rates of imprisonment for black Americans. According to the FBI and the U.S. Census Bureau, black Americans are much more likely to be arrested for drugs than white Americans, even though their comparative usage of drugs is nearly identical. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, black Americans receive longer sentences than white Americans for the exact same crimes, not only drug crimes. The 1994 crime bill that Biden so fervently supported made things worse. That was then, and this is now, though, right? Well, as recently as 2016, Biden was asked if he was ashamed of the crime bill. He said, "Not at all. As a matter of fact, I drafted the bill, if you remember. By and large, what it really did, it restored American cities." But did it, Joe? Was the crime bill the cause of the decrease in the crime? Many researchers actually say no. Although the U.S. makes up about 4% of the world's population, it accounts for a staggering 22% of the world's prison population. The U.S. is out of line not only with its developed peers, but also with authoritarian nations. A panel from the National Academy of Sciences concluded in 2012 that higher incarceration rates had, at best, a modest effect on the decline. The panel also found little indication of a deterrent effect, concluding, "The incremental deterrent effect of increases in lengthy prison sentences is modest at best." Because recidivism rates decline markedly with age, lengthy prison sentences, unless they specifically target very high-rate or extremely dangerous offenders, are an inefficient approach to preventing crime by incapacitation. Basically, most offenders reach a point when they age out of criminal behavior, which limits the benefits of mandatory minimum sentencing. Lengthy prison sentences are ineffective as a crime control measure in nearly all circumstances. In fact, a lot of research suggests harsh prison sentences and conditions make convicts more likely to reoffend. Actual contributing factors to the drop in crime include greater economic growth in the 90s, causing less need for crime to make ends meet, lower unemployment, reproductive rights, lead regulations, pharmacological advances, and a host of other smaller progressive changes. There is no one reason why the crime rate dropped, but one thing we do know is that the crime bill's effect on the drop in crime was marginal at best, which means that its negative effects far outweigh its alleged positives. Voters want politicians who are tough on crime to this day, even though said voters still think that the crime rate was as bad as in the 80s. It's not Mad Max out there, guys. If nominated by the Democrats, Biden's history with mass incarceration will have the same deleterious effect on his campaign as the super predator line had on the Hillary Clinton campaign. This means he will either double down on being tough on crime and enact more of these regressive laws when president, or he'll crash and burn on the campaign trail because of it, just like Clinton. Neither possibility is all that appealing. Alright, lightning round, let's wrap things up. When Roe v. Wade gave reproductive rights to women in America, Biden exclaimed, "I don't like the Supreme Court decision on abortion. I think it went too far. I don't think that a woman has the sole right to say what should happen to her body." He has changed his opinions here and there over the years and is now technically pro-choice, but he still, up until a few days ago, supported the restrictive Hyde Amendment. His record on women's reproductive rights is spotty at best, and during a time in which those rights are genuinely under threat by state governors and this goober, Biden's not exactly the best Democrat that the voters can choose to advocate for women. Biden has publicly blamed people in their 20s and 30s for their financial hardships instead of sympathizing with the fact that the older generation ruined the market. Biden is a walking, talking, millennials killed the blank industry clickbait think piece, and based on this cold-hearted, shitty take, there is no reason to assume he will do anything to help, like raise the minimum wage. Biden presided over the extremely sexist interrogation of Anita Hill, refusing to take responsibility for her treatment for decades until it became politically convenient. She did not accept his apology, nor should she, because it happened right when he was about to announce his candidacy, and was therefore politically motivated and insincere. He is way too comfortable with the Republican Party, probably because he shares many of their values, and he personally likes actual war criminal Dick Cheney. He has a very close relationship with lobbyists, especially financial institutions, even attending retreats with them. If he gains the presidency, he will be about as compromised as many other bought politicians. Biden's policies have been so toxic to the US that I didn't even have to spend too much time on this video talking about how he's kinda creepy and invades people's personal space. I mean, it is creepy, and the fact that he had to be dragged kicking and screaming to make an empty pseudo-apology that he later backtracked, mocked, and violated on the campaign trail only days later is just a whole thing, right? But I don't even need to dive too deep into that in order to explain why a Biden presidency would be worse for the United States than an administration run by someone else in his party. Although, small note on that, a debate between Trump and Biden in which they both call each other perverts might actually kill me. I have a weak stomach. When Trump talked about how big his dick was, I almost threw up my own skeleton. It's also important to note that Joe Biden is only one man. He didn't do all of this alone, and the racist and capitalist institutions that he helps maintain existed long before himself, and will exist without him. I don't mean to pin all of America's woes on Joe Biden of all people, or individualize these systemic problems. But the debates and primaries are effectively about how these politicians have individually contributed to the gains and losses for our country. Even if we can't pin all of the woes on an individual, it is necessary to pin down what they believe in and what they will do if elected. I hope I have done this today. Biden's alleged electability, literally the only thing anyone says is in his favor, is an illusion. He has so much riding against him, and so much that can and will be used against him should he earn the nomination. He doesn't have more inherent electability than the other major Democrats. That's a false narrative that he loves peddling, and the media is happy to quote him verbatim instead of challenging him on that demonstrable falsehood. There are 10,000 other candidates, and we can do better than Joe Biden.
It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society.